co-chairing together with Heather, that will provide the next presentation of the working group on forest accounts of SEEA-EA. So the outline of my presentation going to be basically on 5 points. First, a rationale, why do we need forest accounts at all? The second, some opportunity and challenges ahead that we have on forest accounting. But the main point of my presentation will be on having a comparison or some relations and issues in the true perspective from SEEA, so basically from the central framework, from the ecosystem accounting framework in developing forest accounts. And I will raise a few major issues that I hope that could help for further discussions. Then I will provide just one example on developing these accounts. And finally, I will present very briefly what is the working group of forest accounts on SEEA is about. Okay, so what do we need? What is the rationale? Why do we need forest account at all? First of all, because forest ecosystem, we all know there is a critical components of the world's biodiversity in many aspects. Forests are one of the most dominant type of land use, land cover ecosystems in many countries, especially in tropical areas, and in developing countries is still one of the major ecosystem types. And forests are highly relevant supplier of multiple ecosystem services, which are essential for not only our economy, but also for our well-being.
Ah, solo las ti hai guardato?
Sì.
I think there is some.
L'ho finito, però non lo finisco.
Yeah. Okay. Besides this, deforestation and degradation continues in many parts of the world at an alarming rates. And this contrasting reality between the importance of the forest ecosystem, but the urgent need of conservation of this ecosystem is helping. I mean, is having an important component in the needs for forest accounts. Forest accounts can play a crucial role in supporting key environmental policies, and not only at international level, like the Convention of Biological Diversity or climate change. But I also think that at national and regional, even local level, there is a spatial planning, financing, at least a whole bunch of policies that conservation that can be very, very important to have forest accounts. And finally, there is one more, which is very practical, which is the forest account has been requested by different international organizations, UNSD and the European Commission and Eurostat, especially, is having a request on forest accounts, both in the central framework and in the ecosystem accounting framework, which need an implementation strategy that involves building capacity in many countries. So, the opportunities and challenges ahead for forest accounts, as you will see, I will only talk about one each because I don't have time for more. But the main opportunity that we have is the forest account can be compiled by extending, adapting, and integrating existing SEEA frameworks and complementing the system of national accounts. You all know that the SEEA Central Framework was adopted as a statistical standard in 2013, and a subsystem of this central framework, there is this SEEA on agricultural, forestry, and fisheries accounts that is part of that. And actually, the new EU regulation on forest accounts is related to this part of the central framework. And in March 2021, it was adopted as a statistical standard, also this SEEA ecosystem accounts. But, well, seems that the main challenge that we have is that ensuring consistency among these frameworks, data sources, and conceptual relations for these different frameworks to develop forest accounts is quite a big challenge ahead. In the meanwhile, I have heard yesterday from someone reporting on the global status of SEEA implementation for the 2022, that many countries, and especially 91 countries, is compiling the SEEA central framework, and 41 countries is compiling the ecosystem accounting frameworks. What usually happens is that many countries start with forest accounting, so I can guess that many of these countries has already started developing and compiling their forest accounts, and probably we need to make sure that there is some kind of consistencies among all these frameworks. So going to the main point of my presentation, we have one ecosystem, which is forest, but we have these two different perspectives, the central framework and the ecosystem accounting framework. And I'm going to try to give a few points that probably need further reflections on how we can complement and make consistency about these two different frameworks. The first point is about the conceptual framework itself. So it's in the conceptualization on how we define or we develop forest accounts. In the central framework, you all know that central framework looks at the economy, how the economy uses natural inputs, for instance, timber, and returns back to the environment, for instance, emissions. So this is the basic conceptual framework from the central. And as you can see, this is used in the circular economy framework, but the relationship among economy and environment is very simple. And this is exactly why probably the ecosystem accounting came out, because the ecosystem accounting complements perfectly the central framework by taking the perspective of the ecosystem. So we are not only talk about timber now, we talk about, for instance, forest as an ecosystem type that consider how they interact with society as a part of a natural process within a given spatial area. So the relations among ecosystem assets and society and economy is much more multidimensional. We have all these ecosystem services and benefits that needs to be taken into account. And not only that, but also it has to be done in a spatial manner, which is also quite important. The next point is about the standardization of measurements. So what in each of these two frameworks, what is required to measure itself? So in the central framework, basically the main components of accounting is the assets, and assets are considered as items of value to economy and society. And for instance, in forest accounts, what basically the main assets that is considered or account is for timber. In the accounting, ecosystem accounting framework, this has been a bit, let's say, amplified, and the assets that we measure in the ecosystem accounting is ecosystem itself. So we talk about forest as a providing of services. So services are considered as the contribution, either direct or indirect contribution of ecosystems to the economy and the social well-being. And this is a conceptual difference, but make a whole difference in the way that we measure things. And let me spend a bit on these ecosystem services. So the forest ecosystem services that, let's say, are considered in the central framework is basically timber or wood provisioning services. This is the whole list of reference list of selected ecosystem services adopted in the SEEA-EA, and in the central framework we only consider wood. While in the ecosystem accounting framework, we are not only counting for wood or timber, but a whole bunch of regulating agricultural service has to be also taken in consideration. And this is especially important because if we want to make sure that all the information is made for the purpose of sustainable or sustainability use, it's very important that we make sure that we don't try just to maximize one ecosystem services. There is a whole scientific literature that you probably know that maximization of target assets and ecosystem services is causing trade-offs among. So if we, for instance, just try to maximize wood productions, this can cause trade-off among all different ecosystem services. And in the new framework, these relationships about the different ecosystem services can be taken into account and make sure that all the values and information that we put is really making use for sustainable purposes. The next point that I would like to raise is about the forest definitions and classifications. In the central framework, what is considered as, let's say, forest, what is considered, let's say, is environmental assets. And in terms of the forest, is timber resources. You here in this table can see the classification of environmental assets from the central framework. And in terms of what is related directly to forest is timber resources, that is classified based on cultivated and natural areas. Well, I don't know in other parts of the world, but in Europe and well, in Spain, this where I have worked with the ministry and the statistical office, this is causing a lot of conceptual difficulties because what is considered cultivated or natural forest is really difficult to capture in Europe. Most of our forest is secondary managed forest, and what is considered natural or cultivated is really difficult to put a kind of a line there. So the definition and conceptualization on how do we find forest is very difficult. Now there is this new concept on forest available for wood supplies and not available for food supplies or for wood supply, which is also an improvement for the other one, but is still kind of conceptually difficult to implement. In the ecosystem accounting framework, as you all know, this have been adopted or recommended, the IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology, that specifically for forest, there is around, we have been revising this classification and how they defined, and there's around 20 functional groups that are identified as forest, ecosystem with actually with potential spatial distribution. So it's not only about they classify in a hierarchical system and well-defined, but they also provide some kind of recommendation based on environmental characteristics on how the potential distribution of these forest systems can be identified in a spatial manner. And this is quite an improvement, in my opinion, on how we define and classified forest. And finally, in terms of the comparison between the two frameworks, is about the outputs itself. So as you know, in the central framework, basically the main outputs are usually accounting tables, as the one that I presented here as an example, that usually visualize stocks and flows of timber assets in physical and monetary terms. This has been, let's say, complemented again or improved from the ecosystem accounting framework, which is not only presenting, let's say, stocks and flows of timber, but is presenting accounting tables of ecosystem services supply and use in physical and monetary terms. And besides the ecosystem services supply and use, they also provide ecosystem extent and condition in biophysical manner. So I can put here an example of how this is usually presented in the ecosystem accounting framework. And beside this, they also provide spatial information for all these accounts, which in terms, again, for sustainable management, for instance, having spatial information is totally crucial. So the spatial domain of this framework is really an improvement. I'm almost to the end of my presentation, but I would like to provide you an example of how, for instance, Eurostat has developed an accounting exercise at the European level for ecosystem services in the entire European Union. This is a publication from 2021. And if you see the supply of ecosystem services for the major ecosystem types identified in the European Union, all of that services from all the ecosystem services from, well, 7 ecosystem services identified amounts for 172 billions of euros. But what really shocked me in this publication is that forests deliver almost 50% of this total supply. If you can see here, almost 50% of the ecosystem services are supplied by forest ecosystems, which put into some kind of figure the importance of forests that I was presented at the beginning. And in this presentation, it's also used not only the supply side, but also the use side of it. And what it also surprised me is that in the use side, forest ecosystems or forestry sector only accounts for less than 9% of that amount, because basically the only services that they supply for forestry sector is the timber. So there is a clear mismatch between the supply and the use, and the difference is something that has to be taken into consideration and value. So the difference between the use and the supply. So because if we only take the consideration of the use, this can be misleading. Finally, my last slide is about the Forest Working Group of SEEA. So the UNSD established the Forest Working Group in November 2001 that I'm together with Heather Cave co-chairing, and we meet regularly every 2 months. We have been already have 9 meetings since then. There is a board membership, around 25 members across national and international organizations. I know that many of the people that are today in this meeting in person there, they are part of our working group. And the main objective of the working group are to contribute to the advancement of the implementation of forest ecosystem accounts, especially at national level, including identifying best practice, models, data, and tools looking both in biophysical and monetary aspects. With this, I thank you, and back to you, Paulo.
Thank you so much, Fernando, for the eloquent set of the scene, and for reminding all of us that the socioeconomic dimension of the measurements of the ecosystem accounts. So at the end of the day, we are measuring the asset and the ecosystem and the flows, which are ecosystems, vis-a-vis to the beneficiaries. You may think if you have $10,000 on your bank account, that's the asset, it's yours. And the interest rate you get at the end of each year, let's say $1,000 if you're lucky today, are the flow of that asset. So there are 2 distinct concepts that Fernando eloquently discussed here. And I'm very happy that this was the beginning with this comparative static analysis, and we continue to Heather. Heather is joining us from Australia, and I thank you, Heather, for your tenacity in being with us late in the evening in Australia. She was going to talk about Australian forest carbon accounts, and Heather is a principal research fellow in the Climate Action Beacon at Griffith University in Australia, and she's also, as Fernando said, a co-chair of the Working Group on Forests from the UNSEEA. She's by training a forest ecologist with experience in experimental measurement in forests and modeling at landscape scales. She uses ecosystem accounting to synthesize information in a form relevant to inform forest management and climate policy. Mademoiselle Heather, the floor is yours. And we can see the slides.
Thank you, and thank you, Paulo, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me to give an example from Australia of forest ecosystem accounts. And I'm illustrating here the many components and perspectives about forests that I will talk about. So my case study is a forest region in southeast Australia, about 100 kilometres north of the city of Melbourne, where we compiled ecosystem accounts. This is a wet sclerophyll eucalypt forest where extensive ecological measurements were used to scale up data from trees to plots to the landscape to provide the spatial and temporal data that was summarised by compiling ecosystem accounts. This is the forest, and it is home to a diverse range of plants and animals, including several endangered species and ecosystems. It is a mountainous area with high rainfall and provides the main source of water for the city of Melbourne. It is a popular area for recreation and tourism. However, the trees are also used as a source of native timber that is clear-cut and regenerated. And this leads to conflicts in land use, which include regional forest agreements for the supply of native timber, a proposal for an expanded reserve system as the Great Forest National Park, water supply catchments for the Water Authority, Melbourne Water, endangered wildlife and degradation of habitat, high demand for recreational uses, and adjacent is area of high agricultural productivity. The objective of our study was to provide information in a format relevant to informing decision-making about environmental management in this region. The ecosystem accounts were compiled for extent, condition and services, and this framework integrates all the assets and services within the region. It translates environmental values into economic terms, allows quantitative comparisons within a common framework, and evaluates the trade-offs both spatially and explicitly. The basis of the accounts were ecosystem extent, derived from the local classification of ecological vegetation classes and forest types, and then ecosystem condition that was determined from the age of the forest that regenerated after wildfire or logging. I will explain the carbon accounts in more detail as this is relevant for both national and international climate policy. The carbon stocks as an ecosystem asset are shown in this table, with opening and closing stocks of carbon in the row headings, gross additions and reductions in these stocks, differentiation of reservoirs based on ecosystem types and their condition as the column headings, which are related to storage of carbon and its risk of loss. So in decreasing order of condition or increasing order of risk with natural ecosystems, semi-natural ecosystems, plantations and agriculture. These columns of ecosystem types can be further disaggregated to separate areas of new plantings, logged areas, regrowth, or protected areas that will differentiate the condition of the carbon stocks. The reference level for assessing change is the natural ecosystem at its carbon carrying capacity. These data in the table for carbon stocks are based on field measurements of forest biomass at sites with different ages, time since logging and regeneration, and before and after wildfire, and then modelled spatially across the landscape. This diagram illustrates the types of data that go into an ecosystem service supply and use table with the flows of carbon between economic units based on the native forest. Similar data were used for hardwood and softwood plantations to compare the different forest management practices and industries. The blue letters refer to quadrants in the next diagram. This is the physical supply and use table for the ecosystem services of carbon storage and sequestration. Carbon sequestration is an annual flow, and carbon storage is the standing stock of carbon in the ecosystem. Transfers from supply to use are shown as yellow cells for carbon sequestration, green for carbon storage, and orange for products, and blue for the sink service of the atmosphere for the produced emissions. In the top supply table, the two ecosystem services are supplied by environment units based on a classification of ecosystem type spatial units that differentiate forest management types. In the bottom use table, the ecosystem services are used by economic units classified by industries. Use of carbon in managed production forests is by the forestry industry. Use of carbon in conservation forests is by the government as a collective good. In using carbon stock accounts to inform climate mitigation policies, we need to know the reference condition from which to assess changes in carbon stocks that have occurred in the past and the potential to restore stocks in the future. Setting this reference is important for designing policies and evaluating progress towards targets. The reference condition is an ecosystem with high integrity that is represented as a primary forest. The map shows the extent of relatively intact and undisturbed forest in the dark green. The carbon stocks in primary forests are considered at their carbon carrying capacity. The two graphs show the frequency distribution of carbon stock density as tonnes of carbon per hectare. The more area of the graph to the right represents a higher proportion that is covered by carbon-dense forest. The dark green represents the carbon stock distribution in primary forests at carbon carrying capacity. The lighter green represents the current carbon stock in forests of varying ages, depending on their management and disturbance history. The top graph represents the spatial data for the Southeast Australian case study, with carbon stocks across the landscape. I've also been working on identifying the carbon carrying capacity in various regions globally, and the bottom graph shows data for Europe. Climate regulation depends on the magnitude and longevity of the carbon stored in the biosphere and the consequent stock in the atmosphere. The top graph shows carbon storage as retention of stocks, and that protection and restoration of forests increase in value as they accumulate carbon, whereas secondary forests decrease in average age and hence carbon stocks and value. The bottom graph shows carbon sequestration as annual flows that reflect annual fluctuations related to disturbance events rather than long-term trends. Hence, retention of stocks best reflects storage of carbon in the biosphere, and this is the important metric for climate mitigation. The accounts for all the ecosystem services measured in this case study region were combined and summarised as the value of each over time. The values for water provisioning, food provisioning from cropping and grazing, carbon sequestration, and cultural and recreation services are multiple times greater than the value of native forest timber provisioning. In managing land uses in the region, trade-offs are needed in the supply and use of the different ecosystem services. These trade-offs were analysed as the counterfactual case, that is, the difference in the industry value added of ecosystem services if native forest harvesting had not occurred. Harvesting reduces the ecosystem condition of native forests for carbon storage, water yield, recreation, amenity, and biodiversity. Known gains were calculated in carbon sequestration and water supply. Even with the loss of native timber production, the total value of ecosystem services is higher due to these known gains. Potential gains were those assumed gains in plantation timber supply and tourism that are likely to occur if the native forests were not harvested. Additionally, substantial gains would occur for habitat for biodiversity through improved ecosystem condition of older forests. The spatial distribution of the value of ecosystem services was calculated as continuous variables and range normalized to an index and displayed as 5 classes for water yield, carbon stock density, and native timber provisioning. Comparison of the distributions of each of these ecosystem services allows locations of greatest conflict to be identified. The indices for the 3 ecosystem services were combined to produce an interaction index that shows the hotspots of highest values for all ecosystem services, shown in red. Trade-offs between land uses are required in the locations where these activities conflict. This is represented by the area of native forest that is currently available for harvesting. This is the map on the left. The hotspots occur in the areas with red rings, which means that they have good timber resources, occur within water catchments, and are carbon-dense forests. So to summarise about the evidence from carbon accounts that is useful for both national and international policies, we see that the evidence includes the changing condition assessed against a natural reference condition, tracking progress towards targets such as restoration or climate mitigation, valuation of ecosystem services, including those services previously unrecognised, valuation of economic uses of ecosystem services by industry and society, the spatial assessment of conflicting areas of land use, potential gains and losses due to trade-offs between these land uses, and lastly, but I think very importantly, the accounts allowed judgments about relative values of conservation without necessarily having monetary valuation. In our case study, for example, it means that reducing the threat of extinction of a species, so in our case, a threatened species of a possum, by conserving its habitat, may be considered worth more than the loss of revenue from native timber harvesting. The information in the ecosystem accounts has been used in Australia by governments, but also for informing the community and environmental groups. And lastly, looking at international policy, the SEEA ecosystem accounts provide the framework for comprehensive and consistent information across the Rio Conventions and to link climate, biodiversity and sustainable development goals. These 6 key elements in the blue boxes of the SEEA within a statistical standard offer great opportunities for these international policies. Implementing SEEA-EA carbon accounts to inform greenhouse gas inventory reporting to the UNFCCC will greatly enhance the policy relevance of the data and reveal greater opportunities for managing forests for integrated climate mitigation, biodiversity conservation and restoration outcomes. Comprehensive carbon accounts using a reference condition of high ecosystem integrity will allow operationalising the ecosystem provisions of the Paris Agreement and synergistic climate and biodiversity action by bridging the UNFCCC and the CBD. Thank you.
We thank you, Arthur, for this fascinating presentation on this topic of forest carbon services. Take into account the very intelligent approach that you have discussed with us from the supply and the demand, take into account these two different, let's say, aspects of the same phenomena, as well as, and also touches the point of Fernando about the different elements of value of the different forest ecosystem services. However, I just ask you to ask all of us to be careful, because sometimes those benefits, as measured in terms of accounting or economic terms, are not necessarily the same as the local population in situ receives, and therefore most probably collecting the wood becomes, even if the smallest source of value, the most tangible one. But we discussed that more at the end. I want to be as much as possible a neutral session share. Having that, I will thank again Heather. I ask you to keep the questions for the end, and we move forward to the presentation by FAO on implementing international frameworks for environmental economic accounts for forests. And here with us we have Javier, and a colleague of mine at FAO headquarters, and he's a forest officer at FAO since 2020. And his role is to implement and assist with projects and activities aimed at providing a better understanding and on the extent and the condition of global forests, and is responsible, among others, in the publications like Global Forest Resource Assessment, or you call FRA. I don't like acronyms, but apparently FRA is very appealing, as well as the FRA Remote Sensing Survey. Prior to join FAO, Javier has worked with the UNEP WCMC in Cambridge, providing technical assistance to countries in the use of spatial data to inform conservation and restoration actions. Javier, the floor is yours. Grazie mille.
Thank you very much, Paulo. Thanks for the opportunity to present here today. I would like to complement national case studies that have been presented here today with a view on international frameworks for forest accounts, or more precisely, FAO experience in implementing these frameworks. Because even though these are not strictly SEEA accounts, they are, with no doubt, closely related, and I think the experience in implementing them will be useful for the future implementation of SEEA if it ever it's used for reporting on international frameworks. I don't think I have to convince anyone here that forests and the importance of forests for many global challenges today have put them in the global environmental agenda in recent years. A proof of that is this long list of global policies and commitments to forest. Indeed, as Fernando mentioned before, forests are important for many different services. They are important for timber provision, and that's actually the main goal of one of the first major international agreements on forest. That was the International Tropical Timber Agreement. The last one signed in 2006, but it supersedes one that was signed in the 80s. But also forests are important for climate change mitigation, hence the linkage with UNFCCC, also for biodiversity conservation, hence the linkage with the CBD, and many others. So that's why forests are a priority for any treaty that aims to address the triple planetary crisis, as also have been mentioned here today. But well, as I think, as the Millennium Development Goals taught us, one of the first things that we need to address when trying to achieve these commitments is actually being able to measure and being able to tell if we have achieved these commitments. And for that, we need monitoring systems able to measure progress towards the goals and targets included in these commitments. which in turn needs high-quality international statistical information. In my view, this involves 4 things. One is a system that is able to ensure the timely data flows between national statistical systems and international statistical systems. There is also a need to develop a common terminology. We have mentioned this during these 2 days. Common terminology, definition, metrics to ensure the international comparability. If there are issues sometimes in ensuring comparability at the national scale, imagine at the international level. There is also a need to establish standardized procedures for data review, harmonization, and when necessary, gap filling. This is the capacity to provide global estimates for the countries that they don't submit data. So regional aggregates can be produced. And of course, it's important that all this data that is collected in this way, it's then adequately interpreted and analyzed to transform it into information and knowledge. For what regards to forest, somebody has to do that actually. This is done by a combination of coordination with different institutions at the national and international level, but there has to be a lead. And for what regards to forest, FAO is the institution with the most comprehensive mandate on forest. This is included in the Article 1 of FAO Constitution, which says that the organization shall collect, analyze, interpret, and disseminate information on different topics, but among them forestry and primary forest products. But as in many other constitutions, this mandate is actually quite broad. So how this is articulated and interpreted through time, this is done by the Committee of Forestry. This is the highest FAO statutory body. It's open to all FAO members, the 194, which brings together heads of Forest Service and other senior government officers. And the main goal is to review current programs of work and their implementation, as well as to advise on the future ones. So it's actually the Committee of Forestry, that we call it the COFO, another acronym here, that actually interprets these mandates and put homework to FAO. Just to give you an example, and it also says what we should measure and what we shouldn't measure. And just to give you an example, in the last COFO session that happened later last year, COFO asked FAO to lead the discussions to develop a definition, international agreed definition on forest degradation. So this is the type of work that COFO does. So based on this mandate, FAO has been leading the data collection on 2 main data collection processes related to forest. And this will be the core of my presentation, trying to explain it, the scope of these data collection processes and how this is managed. One is the Global Forest Resource Assessment, which deals with the extent of forest by type, their condition, management, and uses, while the other is the Forest Production and Trade, which deals with the production, import, and export of forest products. Both are based on official country statistics, so data provided by countries. They both started shortly after the FAO Foundation, so in the case of the FRA, which is the acronym of the Global Forest Resource Assessment, started in 1948, while the Forest Production and Trade in 1947. The update frequency is a bit different. The Forest Production and Trade is updated every year. The FRA is updated every 5 years, although we are now moving to a more flexible, frequent reporting, also as a request for COFO. So from now on, countries that have data available and are willing to report this data will be able to do so more frequently. And of course, the scope of these data collection processes has changed a lot since the beginning. But the last version of them, for example, in the case of the FRA, examines the status of trends of more than 60 forest-related variables from 1990 to 2020, while the Production and Trade looks at the 59 product categories, including primary products such as round wood, soundwood, pulp and paper, but also secondary products as well, such as wood and furniture and packaging materials. The data collection is actually quite similar. I will say that the main Difference is the actual physical way through the data is collected. The FRA is collected through a dedicated online platform, while the production and trade is collected through an Excel template, a questionnaire that is sent to countries and given by email. They are essentially the same. The main difference, I would say, is that the online platform gives the added benefit that facilitate data entry and also minimize data entry errors, so the introduction of logical checks that can be introduced in the platform. All this is done in collaboration with other international institutions, such, for example, UNICE, the ITO, the Montreal Process, COMIFAC in the case of the FRA. In the case of the forest production and trace, also UNICE is involved, also ITO is involved, and in addition, the European Commission is involved. This basically means that data is collected once and used by many. So the idea is that in order to minimize the reporting burden by countries, the data collection is carried out by FAO, but then is shared with these other institutions, and the data that is collected is agreed with these institutions. An important component of all this process is that the capacity building that is done regularly, which of course varies depending on the process. But the idea is has two main goals. One is to build the capacity of countries that have more difficulty more challenges when reporting, but also to maximize consistency. So, for example, in the case of the FRA, this is done in regional workshops by which national focal points meet in working sessions, and they manually enter the data together with FAO technicians in order to ensure that the definitions are correctly interpreted. And when there are potential disagreements or doubts, these are discussed together in this regional workshop. And actually, in less than a couple of weeks, I will be in Panama to work with our colleagues from Latin America to prepare for the next FRA. Of course, and also ensuring data quality and interoperability is an important component. In both processes, a comprehensive list of terms and definitions, guidance materials, classifications, conversion factors are regularly updated and published. And these are important because this is not just for these processes. These documents, definitions, eventually become reference documents that are used in academia, in research, but are also used by countries when developing their own definition. It's not that they copy this definition, but they definitely take it into account because it has the added value that then it facilitates the international reporting. In both cases, the data submitted is reviewed by FAO to ensure completeness, consistency, and the alignment with the terms and definitions and classification mentioned before. And again, in both processes, when countries are not able to report data, we estimate global estimates based on global data. So, for example, in the case of the FRA, is usually remote sensing data, to be able to fill these gaps and be able to aggregate this data at regional and global level. And in relation to that, one thing that we are particularly proud of is the FRA Remote Sensing Survey. This is an independent data collection process by which FAO leads, but in collaboration with national technicians, some of them involved in the FRA, but also other people working in the government and research organization. We collect samples through visual interpretation of high-resolution images to estimate forest trends and the forest and changes in forest area. So both forest expansion and deforestation. In the last one, this was done through the collection of 400,000 samples in collaboration with more than 800 people from 126 countries. And again, this has the advantage to not only to collect data to show, to develop the results that I will show you now, but also to, at the same time, again, build capacity so countries are able to adopt this methodology and use it for the national reporting processes. And this is, for example, the case of Papua New Guinea, Brazil, that they have actually adopted the methodologies for their own purposes and objectives as well. So one of the cool things of this independent process is that first we are able to estimate variables that are already estimated by the FRA, not to duplicate things, but actually to check if the data is accurate. So for example, the plot at the left-hand side shows the net changes in forest cover in the last 20 years. And it shows that the deforestation has happened mostly in the tropical biome, while forest has mostly increased in the other biomes. The deforestation is decreasing, but it's still quite important. And the good thing is, well, the good thing, if there is something good about this, is that this confirms the result of the FRA, so the data reported by country. So that means that we can be reasonably confident about the data. But also another good thing is that this allows us to come up with new information. For example, this is the plot of the right-hand side. This is deforestation drivers. This is data not collected by the FRA because not all countries have it. But it allows us to say that 90% of the deforestation is driven by agricultural expansion. So this is strong evidence to show that in order to address deforestation in the tropics, food consumption habits in other areas outside the tropic has to be addressed. Otherwise, it will be impossible. How the data is disseminated, it's done in a variety of ways, but basically the data is available online using open data licenses. It allows single queries through just figures, data visualization, but also bulk downloads, but also regular and periodically updated reports are produced. And one of the main objectives is the transparency of the data. That means that at least for the FRA, we want that any value, the users that access any value is able to trace where the data comes from. And this is mostly comes from the country reports. So one can go to the website and go, for example, to the values of a given country for a given year, and they were able to know what was the data source used for that. Regarding the policy processes that are informed by these two data collection processes, for example, the Global Forest Resource Assessment is used in agenda setting and policy formulation. And in fact, if you look at the European Green Deal, the law, there are several references to the FRA, to the data coming from the FRA as reasons to take action and to develop this policy. But it's also used for policy monitoring. The data from the FRA is used to inform 2 SDG indicators. It has also been identified as a potential data source for monitoring the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, and has also been proposed as one of the data sources for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The forest production and trade the data is also being used for simulations to inform changes in policy. And it's also being used for the Kyoto Protocol for what regards to the carbon storage in harvested wood products. But well, as many things in life, these data sets are not perfect and they have challenges. I will say that for the Global Forest Resource Assessment, one of the challenges is the lack of national capacity in certain countries for long-term forest monitoring. This is quickly growing, but if we aim to analyze long trends, this is not always possible. I will also say that biodiversity-related information and ecological condition could be better monitored. There are not many variables, and some of them are not. And the data that is collected through these variables doesn't have the quality that we would like. One of them, for example, is primary forest area, which is collected by the FRA, but that suffers a bit from lack of comparability. That means that the data coming from countries are not fully comparable, so it's difficult to aggregate them and establish conclusions. And for that, a specialist study started in 2020 to improve reporting. For the forest production and trade, one of the biggest amount of gap filling is wood fuel production that is mentioned here. For about 150 countries, do not submit data. So this data is estimated by FAO. And because of that, a new project has started to develop new models to improve the accuracy of the data. Try to go fast. So now we have this new kid in the block, which is the SEEA for ecosystem accounting, which, as my colleagues presented before, mentioned that they have the potential to deliver additional evidence to inform policy need for forest. But it arrives to quite a populated and crowded landscape of international forest reporting. So I had these two questions that I will try to answer. Not to be prescriptive and to close the debate, but actually the opposite, to try to open the debate and start the discussion. One of them that I think is important is how existing international frameworks can contribute to a successful implementation of the SEEA for ecosystem accounting, and the other is the opposite. How successful implementation of the SEEA for ecosystem accounting can benefit these existing processes. So regarding the first question, I think that SEEA for ecosystem accounting will benefit if it builds on already established agreed terms and definition, classification and crosswalks, accounts, production cycles, and accounting structures. I mean, some of the definitions used by the FRA and forest production and trade have been used for decades. National focal points are now familiarized with this definition. I have established methodologies to crosswalk national data to international definitions. So I think it will be good as far as possible to build on this rather to build something new. And the second, how SEEA for ecosystem accounting could contribute to existing processes. I think one of them is spatial explicitness. Most of the data that source that inform the FRA is spatial explicit, but the FRA is not yet spatial explicit. It's mostly tabular data. Although stay tuned because we are working on this for the future FRAs. I believe that existing processes could benefit from the more detailed information on forest ecosystem types. The FRA does disaggregate data about different forest types and also by biome, but this classification is not as detailed as the IUCN global ecosystem typology. And also I will say that the existing process will benefit with actually the assessment on condition and actually with the use of more standardized comprehensive assessment of forest ecological conditions, as some of the colleagues here presented today have shown us. And I will give you a final example. I mentioned before the problem of reporting against primary forest. This is, for example, the kind of decision tree that national focus points have to answer when reporting different forest types for the FRA. It is okay to report forest area, natural forest, plantation forest from our experience in FAO. Countries have pretty good knowledge on this and are able to report this. But with more complex concepts such as primary forest, so if you look at the definition, it mentions that it's a forest composed by native tree species with no clear indications of human activity and where the ecological processes are not significantly disturbed. Where we see here reference to ecological processes, but doesn't mention which ecological processes. It mentions not significantly disturbed, but doesn't explain what significantly means. Of course, this cannot be done in a definition because this, otherwise it won't be a definition, will be a scientific article of a report. But that's what I think the assessment of condition from the SEEA for ecosystem accounting could help is because through the objective assessment of several indicators of condition, carbon, biodiversity, with agreed and standardized procedures that can be then comparable at international level, we'll be able to solve this problem by not establishing a line between what is primary forest or not, but actually see a gradual assessment of ecological conditions. And I finish here. That's all for my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thank you so much, Javier. I apologize for interrupting, but we need to keep for the respect of everyone, the timeline sharp. What I like to highlight with you is that this exercise that it was so comprehensively explicit is not done by FAO alone, it's done with other agencies, and these, among other things, two heads think better than one, and they minimize the burden across the member countries in collecting data. Without further ado, we move from the national to international, and we go more local to the European context, and I invite Arturo to discuss with us the updates from Eurostat on this field. The floor is yours, Arturo.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. So I prepared a few slides about what Eurostat is doing about forest accounts in the sense of the central framework. Eurostat is also working on the ecosystem accounts that were presented in the morning and mentioned before in this session, also for forests. So that work in ecosystem accounts is going to bring results about the forest extent, forest condition, and forest services. But that is not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about a central framework, sort of old-fashioned forest accounts that are more related to what Javier just explained. So perhaps one of the key messages I want to give you is that, and I think I'm going to cut short my slides because I want to focus on a few key messages. One of them is that we think there is room to have these two accounts, the central framework and the ecosystem accounts, both providing complementary information about forests. And when it comes to the central framework forest accounts, we think we have a clear, no, it's not working. Where should I point it? Here or to you? Oh. Could you, sorry, could you, no. No. The starting point is that there are different data collections that some of them were mentioned before by the previous speaker, Javier, about the FAO-FRA that takes place every 5 years in most countries. The Joint Forest Sector Questionnaire was also mentioned. This is an annual questionnaire in which Eurostat also collects data from European countries. We are the European Commission Service in charge of it. And there is also UNFCCC. And in Europe, in addition to the Joint Forest Sector Questionnaire, we have European forest accounts. We call them that way. This is what I'm going to talk about, that we collect in the current form since 2014. No, I think this is not correct, it's 16. But this data collection on European forest accounts, SEEA, central framework style, have a voluntary basis. This means we never have every single country in the European Union reporting. There is always some country missing. This is a problem to calculate, to have a complete picture of the situation in the European Union. And for this reason, we want now to create a legal basis to make it mandatory in all the European countries. We think that the basic, what we want to achieve is basically what the data that we have in these European forest accounts reported with international definitions, basically aligned to FAO-FRA, what was just presented, but every year. We think it's very important to have the data every year, in particular for indicators such as SDGs. Having this data every 5 years is not enough, at least in Europe, is not enough to monitor progress on a regular basis. So what we are putting forward in the proposal that to have mandatory accounts in Europe is to have 4 mandatory accounts. They are about wooded land, timber in physical units, timber in monetary values, and some economic aggregates of the forestry and logging industry. I'm going to say a word about each one of these tables in a moment. But basically, this is wooded land, and this is timber. It was Fernando, I think, one of the previous speakers that explained that the only service that forests provide in the SEEA Central Framework way is about the timber. This is correct. So it's a limited scope, but it has some advantages. First is a well-tested and proven type of information that we can collect. As Javier explained, we have decades of experience collecting this type of data. When we talk about values, monetary evaluations, it is not controversial, contrarily to ecosystem accounts, and we have more solid estimation methods. So there are some advantages in producing this type of information in addition and complementing the ecosystem accounts. Now I want to say very quickly, we use wooded land definition based on FAO. with breakdowns of forest available for wood supply and not available for wood supply, as well as other wooded land. And on a voluntary basis, we propose to collect from European countries also other land with tree cover. This is a different concept. So all these concepts are based on the framework established by FAO. So it's a very well-established framework. And we seek to have annual reporting. For us, this is a must for this type of information. So the first table we want to collect is area of wooded land. We want to distinguish opening area at the beginning of the reference year, then changes during the year, 3 bullet points that corresponds to afforestation, another increases, deforestation, another decreases, and statistical reclassification. And then a closing area at the end. So this is an asset account in the classic way. We need clear definitions about the 3 bullet points in the middle: afforestation, deforestation, statistical reclassifications. The countries ask for this type of guidelines to ensure that they all interpret the concepts in the same way. As regards volume of timber, we are going to request different granularity, different level of detail for forest available for wood supply and not available. We want more detail, of course, for the forest available for wood supply, because in addition to the opening stock, that is the first item on the left, and the closing stock, that is the last item on the left, we ask for several changes during the year: net increment of the live trees, removals, this is the wood removed from the forest. These two are the most important changes, categories in which we are interested. And then we will also have irretrievable losses that are in part related to forest fires, but not only. Statistical reclassifications, so land that changes from available to non-available, and the balancing item for other reconciliation items, so that we have the total at the beginning, the opening stock, and the total at the end. The closing stock can be reconciled perfectly. For the forest not available for wood supply, we just want a simpler version of this breakdown. Similarly, for the value of timber, we will have different categories. They are quite similar, but not fully identical to the categories for the volume of timber. And then finally, we will have a table with economic variables of the forestry and logging industry, defined forestry and logging industry defined in terms of ISIC or terms of NACE classification in Europe. And you see the variables here: output, intermediate consumption, gross value added, consumption of fixed capital, etc. The experience in Europe is that this is the table that the countries report more easily. This is the most reported table in the European Union. And almost all the variables are widespread available. The category that countries have more difficulty in reporting is the last one: capital transfers. Several countries state difficulties in reporting this information. We intend to write a handbook in the next 15 months with a deadline June 24. With the basic structure that you see here. We want to spell out the concepts that are necessary to fill the tables, and also to provide some guidance about estimation methods. Many countries report to us that, yes, they can fill these tables, but only the year they have the national forestry inventory, and not in between. So we have to provide guidance how to fill these tables in between years. And here there are some links where to find more information, and that's all from my presentation. The bottom line I want to give is that we believe in Eurostat that it makes sense to have forest accounts in the sense of central framework to complement the forest accounts in the sense of ecosystem accounts. For the central framework, we want to use international definitions, starting from FAO, and we think we need annual reporting. And this is what we are proposing to do in the next years. Thank you very much.
Dear Arturo, thank you so much for this zoom in into the forest accounts within the European context, and delighted to hear that there are many things that are being sharing across the organizations in this regard, and this indeed is a fantastic change in terms of having this more regular monitoring of this asset. Having that said, I will invite the colleague from the presentation from Finland Aarre, is he here, as well as Béatrice from France, to join the podium? Online, okay, I have no interest. Aarre is online, so you are already on podium. Béatrice, s'il vous plaît, nous entendons. Et we ask you to be patient and write down your comments and questions to the end. So the next two presentations will continue to go on more on the examples for production and use of forest accounts at the national level, always with a link to informed policy making. From Finland, a presentation with the title Implementation of European Forest Accounts and links with SEEA, and we have with us Aarre. Aarre is a senior statistician working in the bioeconomy statistics group in National Resources Institute, Finland, and his main task of the group is to produce official statistics on agriculture, forestries, and fisheries in Finland. Aarre, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Are you listening to me? Are you hearing what am I saying? And do you see what I'm sharing?
We can see everything. Everything is perfecto.
Okay, thank you. I'm trying to tell you how we are trying to implement the European Union forest accounts. We have usually not reported this kind of information to European Union, but now we are trying to do that in future. And we also got grant funding for this issue. I have one slide of Natural Resources Institute Finland. This is only for the background of our organization here, and you can see from the slide what we are doing. I am not going to tell anything from this slide because this is only a background information. I go straight to the next slide. When we are producing data for forest accounts, we have two sources. The first one is National Forest Inventory. The National Forest Inventory is producing almost all data concerning forest resources, volume, growth, and quality of growing stock, and also biodiversity variables. Forest carbon stocks are calculated from this information and their changes. We have had a cycle of National Forest Inventory about 5 or 10 years between last inventory and the next one. It has been in history about 10 years, but now we have 5 years time period when inventory data is collected. The inventory is conducted by the Natural Resources Institute Finland. The results of inventories are used to monitor the forest resources, and the information obtained is also valuable for international reporting. Also in this case, we are using this kind of data. The results of National Forest Inventory are publicly available. Then I will show you the sampling design of National Forest Inventory. The map in the middle of the slide shows how the clusters of the National Forest Inventory are located in Finland. As we can see, there are more clusters in southern Finland than in northern Finland. The cluster net is so more dense. The mean growing stock is much bigger in southern Finland than in northern Finland, and the perspective in sampling design has been the wood production. And then we have on the right side of the slide the clusters which includes some sample plots. The left one is a sample design in southern part of Finland, and the right side is sample design in middle part of Finland. You can see that there are some temporary clusters that are measured only once. They are marked by K, and then there are also new permanent clusters which are marked by X, and old permanent clusters marked by U. And the old clusters, or I would say permanent clusters, are very good when you are trying to calculate changes during time. So this is our systematic cluster sampling design. We have about 60,000 sample plots per one inventory period. They annually there are measured 1/5 of them, which means that we don't have enough data to calculate estimates for 1 year, but we are calculating estimates for 5 years period. It is about 1 million trees that are measured from those sample plots. And on the right side down, you can see the example of national inventory data. This is as key data. So what we are trying to do, we are trying to make a script that calculates from this data the forest accounts results. As I mentioned, the inventory period takes 5 years, and this actually means that the data collected, for example, increment, which is also 5 years increment period data, the calculated results will represent about time on the average 3 years ago when we calculate inventory results from this data. And increment, in the case increment, it is about situation about 5 or 6 years ago, because the inventory the increment measurements in the inventory are calculated from 5 years time period. When we are talking about national forest inventory based data set, this is the main results that we are reported to European Union come from this data set. National forest inventory produces all forest resources estimates, which mean areas, growing stock, increment of the growing stock. And of course, we are trying to use as little work as possible to produce the forest accounts report. So we should make a script or group of scripts which produce the data for forest accounts report. The script should be easily edited to meet the changes in inventory data and to meet possible changes in the forest accounts reporting. Therefore, there should be scripts for data calculation. In an ideal situation, we press only one button and the whole report will be there. But I think that this is not the situation after all when the project is over. Maybe it needs changes in some parameters before that. We are going to use Aarre software. Aarre is a free software environment for statistical computing and graphics. It compiles and runs in many Unix platforms, Windows and Mac OS. If things turn out to be too complicated, we also use SAS statistical analysis system. But what are the challenges in calculation and what are the features of natural forest inventory? The Forest Accounts Handbook is not ready yet. The definitions are essential for producing estimates. The handbook is very essential thing when discussing definitions of forest categories. We think that we need to be involved in the development of the handbook and try to take care of that there will be nothing that is impossible to calculate. For example, is only stem wood reported? What about branches of trees and so on? Some national classifications differ from the classifications used in forest accounts reporting. This is the reason why national statistics are not enough for forest accounts reporting. For example, the national definition of forest differs from the international forest resources assessment definition. The FAO definitions is quite close of national definitions, but it isn't actually the same. The inventory results are averages for the 5 last years. This means that we do not have estimates based on one certain year from field inventory data. One inventory period lasts 5 years, and it's too uncertain to use data measured only in 1 year, although the field measures cover almost whole country every year. We are using all the time the last measured and validated data of 5 years data period. The oldest year falls out and the new one comes in the calculations. But what about FRA land use classes I mentioned before? Fortunately, the NFI data includes FRA land use classes. In every field compartment, the FRA land use class is estimated and recorded, so we can use it in reporting. The NFA data includes information on availability for wood production. Question is how well the classification matches to forest accounts definitions. For example, there was some economic variables where the land is not used for wood production, but I think that we can use only nature protection area for this thing, because it is the only thing that is stable to use this kind of calculation. The amount of roundwood is available broken down in roundwood assortment, 3 species, logs, pulpwood and wastewood, so we can use this kind of information for valuation of the timber. And this is input to the value of the timber part of forest accounts report. And then I must say that the standard error for small area estimates is a thing that must be taken into account. When comparing consecutive inventory results in forest accounts reports, we must take into consideration the reliability and uncertainty of figures. If you really like to understand what lies behind the change of figures, you must have a standard error of the figures included. Due to the method of National Forest Inventory System, the large area estimates are more reliable than estimates for small areas. So the estimates for forest areas not available for wood supply are less reliable than estimates for areas used for wood production. But what happens when you compare opening stock in the beginning of the year and the closing stock at the end of the year? Is the difference between those figures reliable when we are talking about areas not available for wood supply? Then the other part of the calculation is Luke's statistical units calculations. The last slide was National Forest Inventory connected, but then the statistics come in. National Forest Inventory produces the amount of timber broken down to the classification of forest accounts dataset. So the next thing is to produce calculation system that produces value of timber. Timber price statistics are produced by provinces. In Finland, the price of wood is lower in the northern Finland than in southern Finland, and Finland is quite long country, about 1,100 kilometers. Most of the timber resources are located in southern Finland. Also, timber prices are higher in southern Finland. Although regionality is not needed in forest account reporting, it seems that it is needed in timber valuation. In this case, the timber assortment data must be from the National Forest Inventory should be regional. Luke produces statistics about volumes and prices in industrial roundwood trade. The statistics are based only on commercial wood. Problem of valuation timber in nature protection areas must be solved. So what the price of the example pine logs in the areas not available for wood supply are? Are we using the regional timber market prices or something else? Is the quality of the timber just the same as in other areas? Is there possibility more rot in stems and so on? In Finland, the most areas outside wood production are not so good from the wood production point of view. Is there any alternate method to value a timber located areas not available for wood production? I think that the essential part of reporting is the handbook, and I think that when we get good idea what we must report, then we are maybe able to report what European Union likes we to have. Now I have spent 15 minutes, 6 seconds. Thank you.
Fantastic. Like Raikkonen, you are a Ferrari with the timings. Thank you so much, Aarre, for the comprehensive and detailed expose about Finland National Forest Inventory and all the detailed statistic reporting by Finland, and how can this community be enriched by the Finnish experience. I thank you for the presentation. And now we go to the last but not least presentation with Mademoiselle Béatrice from the Ministry of Ecological Transition. We're going to talk about the French experience regarding the implementation of, again, the European forest accounts, national organization set up to build the account and main lessons learned. Mademoiselle, the floor is yours. Merci.
Thank you. So I will not be long because Arturo has already presented the context of the forest account in Europe, and Aarre has already introduce the type of statistic we have for forest. So I will start doing on what we have. So like in Finland, we have a forest inventory, and this forest inventory is quite old. So we have lots of data on forest area, forest production. And like in Finland, we have an inventory based on 5 successive years with field field inventory. So there are some punctual photo interpretation and after for land cover, use of the area, agriculture or wood production, and the size of the formation. But we have after that a field inventory for measuring the trees and increase in the trees and so on, and the vegetation around, and the slope and the access and all the useful information for forestry. So we also have information from the forestry side from the industry, thanks to the Agricultural Statistic Institute, which is doing 2 types of survey, one toward all logging and sawmills on a volume to have the volume of wood harvested and to know how much timber has been sown, and one survey to have the prices of roundwood, and we have the prices in different type of category for species, for quality of logs, and for pulp wood or energy wood or timber. So all this data are so useful for the forest account. And after that, we have also some indicator already developed for a long time ago for the sustainable forest management. And so we have indicator for carbon cycle, for vitality of forest ecosystem, for production function, for diversity of forest ecosystem, for the protection function of the forest and the socioeconomic context of forest. So when we started thinking of forest account, we were not without anything. So the first reflection on forest account started with Eurostat on the end of the 90s. And we participate with 4 other countries, European countries, to a task force on forest account. And from this task force, we had the redaction of a first handbook in 2002. So we are reporting on a voluntary basis since the beginning, so since 2014. But doing the forest account for Eurostat, we are also doing some other tables. So Arturo spoke about the area table, the volume table, the value of timber and economic account. But we also add a carbon account for biomass, wood biomass. We add also table for having a difference between species, not only the wool value of forest, but having a decomposition. And we have also looked at not only the logging and forestry industry, but having all the forest sector in the same type of table. So that's the table. And so what can we say for the French forest? So the French forest has increased in area. So with this graph, you can see a big increase because we start with the 1840. So it has increased a lot, but for the 45 last year, it has increased by 20% and reaching nearly a third of the territory. This increase, so the volume of the wood, of the standing wood has increased on the same time. And during the same 35 years, it has increased by 60%, when the area has increased by 20%. So it means that it has increased more. We get a type of capitalization in the forest. So it's due to a lack of removal and an increase of wood in the new area, and lots of planting in the 60s. Plantation. So right now, the progression, the evolution of the volume is quite stable. It's flat because we have lots of an increase in removal of wood and a kind of loss of an increase in irreversible loss due to scolit and to drought. So it's quite up. So on the side of economic side, so we have the output of the forest and logging industry. So for this output, we can say we can have the outcome. So it's 6 billion euro of output. So the 6 billion, it makes 0.2% of our GDP. So it's not so much, but it is. And half of the output is due to intermediate consumption. So it's mainly the wood itself. And on the right, you have the average price that we are using for doing the calculation of the output of the forest and of the value of the standing wood. This average price, you see the decrease of the average price in 2008 because of the crisis, of the world crisis. And in 2009, it decreased a lot too because of a storm that has put into the market lots of wood suddenly. And in 2020, another decrease because of the COVID and the slope of the activity, of the economic activity. And so looking at the average price, you can see that the output is very dependent on the price, and the value of the forest, of the standing forest, is very dependent on the price. So we can ask if it's a good thing to take the market price to evaluate the value of the forest. So So the difficulty we have with this forest account, so when we discuss about the regulation, the statistic regulation, there are many points come out. So we have little data for forest not available for wood supply, because the inventory is not going in this area, so it's not the inventory is not measuring the wood increase and so on. So we will not be able to have data for that, but it's only 5% of our forest, so we will do what we can. But on the same time, the inventory will probably go on this area because it has an interest for the biodiversity policy, and we have other demand, not only for forest account, but other for the strategy of natural strategy. And so the inventory will probably go more and more on this side. So we will be able to have a little more data. So as for Finland, we don't have lots of data for flow on area, so because the inventory is done on a 5-year basis, so we have not an annual flow account. But we are thinking of using the LULUCF data to be able to approximate these flows. So it will be a way of working. So as I said before, timber stock value is highly dependent on wood price, so it's a failure of the system, maybe. And we have a challenge with non-market flows and to estimate firewood, how much has been removed for firewood as it's not on the market for auto consumption. So we had done a work on that, and this work is also useful for the energy account. So it has some correlation, some connection. So it is interesting to focus on that. Looking at not only forestry and lodging industry, we can compare, look at the wool sector. And so we have seen that forestry and lodging industry is, the output of this sector is 6 billion euro, but when you look at all the sector, it's 37 billion euro. So it's a little more. And when looking at the different branches, we see which one has more added value part. So it's starting being interesting to have another picture, more larger picture. And doing the work, looking at the wool sector, the work has conducted to have a global Sankey flow chart to see how the wood is going from the forest to the different type of wood, pulpwood, firewood, and timber, and to go to the sawmill or to the wood panel industry or to the individual eating or collective eating. And so this chart is one of the first we made, and we did a lot of work on the firewood. So trying to have this the part of that a better picture of it. And the picture is quite difficult because you have also some wood coming from import, export, and wood coming from recycling from the industry too. And so we have to catch this flow. So the work is used to calculate the carbon stock in the woody biomass. So we see the increase of the carbon stock. And the storage each year is about 10 million tons of CO2, when the emission in France are 300 million tons of CO2. And all these indicators are, not all, but some of the indicators are used in different policy in France. So the policy for the carbon, so the low carbon strategy, the policy for the biodiversity, and the policy for forestry. And now we, like Europe, we have a kind of Green Deal with an ecological planification, and this ecological planification is asking to the statistics lots of data to have dashboard for this ecological planification. And so we will use some data of the forest account for that. So for my last slide is just, we haven't speak about risk and climate change, and we think that we will have lots of challenge with climate change, and to see all the illness, to see what will happen with fire and storms, and the data from the forest account will be useful for following disaster and following this risk. That's it. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Béatrice, pour une très belle, très compréhensive et très riche aussi historiquement. Also historically, sorry, rewind and zip. Thank you so much for the rich, comprehensive, and long-standing experience of France in this area of work, including this aspect of creating indicators and creating information in the condensed and presented in a more synthetic way, fitted to the ground. And also this aspect, I like very much the infographics regarding also the element of circularity. But I'm here to moderate now the discussion. So we had 5 very interesting presentations. I leave the room to you, delegates, for questions and answers to the presenters. Okay, we start with the representation of Georgia. The floor is yours. I ask you to be brief, and also if you have a person with whom the question is addressed, and ask her to be brief too. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Not? Yeah, okay. First of all, thank you for the interesting slides and presentation. So frankly speaking, this economic and environmental accounting is a new one for Georgian statistics. So to be honest, we are at the initial point of it. So I mean statistics, not policy, Maya. My question relates to, so it belongs to Mr. Peltola from Finland. Mr. Peltola, you mentioned that 60,000 plots and 1 million trees are selected. So my question relates to sampling design. What is the percentage of total area and how many hectares are covered by the trees and plots? Meanwhile, sub-question. So this sample methodology is you elaborated by your organization, or it's based on Eurostat or UNEC? And there are sub-question also. How the sampling matches and describes forest account needs? Thank you very much.
So much. Please, we can address directly the colleague from Georgia. Okay? From Finland, sorry.
Thank you for the question. The whole land is covered with sampling clusters, and every sampling clusters have sampling plots. I can't say how much area the sample plots are covered. They are partly taken by reloscope and partly with diameter that is constant, but some figures about reliability of the estimates are available because they are counting standard errors of the estimates. But actually, I'm not from National Forest Inventory. I must find the information of standard errors, but the whole land is covered every year. Almost whole land is measured, and after 5 years period, and one inventory cycle is coming to the end, and then the reports are calculated for the inventory cycle. I think that is all I can say about this issue, if I understood the question.
Thank you so much, Aarre. I think you answered the question, and now I will come back to the floor and ask the colleague Paul from Hungary, and then Kaja from Estonia, and then finally Sweden to present simultaneously in the Netherlands. So let's do the two. First Hungary, and then Estonia, and then Sweden and Netherlands to do the questions. So the first to you, Paul, and then Kaja, okay? Thank you.
Thank you. I have a short question to Béatrice. You've showed us the calculation method, or the way how you calculate the first valuation on monetary terms. What sources you have for the value of the standing timber? Thank you.
Could you please also address your question? We address the two together in the floor. So if you could, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you for your presentations. I also asked from the national presentations, and regarding the national presentations. So, as far as I understand, the Finnish presentation was quite a lot about these table A tables, which are more like it's like forest statistics about area and timber stock and removals, but forest accounts is also about economic figures, and it's also there are B tables and C tables which are relevant for the economic variables. So probably those for these you need to do additional work, and both both actually, with both the national presentations, I asked the same questions. So have you done that work on economic indicators as well? And part of the Georgian question wasn't answered, and I would like to ask this question once more. How well is a national forest inventory with area sample-based valuation, estimation of timber flows and wooded land? How well is it suited for the reporting on these A tables of a national European forest accounts? So if you could both come with this part of information as well. So what is missing? What do you need to adjust? So, but we are also doing the pilot calculation. So I have my own ideas about what is the situation. But I would like to know what you have tackled. Thank you.
So the inventory, the forest inventory is giving us data for the A table, so the area and the flow of wood, and not value of wood, just the physical data. And even for the flow, the inventory is not good enough to have the flow. So they will try to work on it to have more precise data, because they are doing a job on field and a job of photo interpretation either on the same time. So they will use more the photo interpretation for the flow and the other data for the rest. And we are thinking of using the LULUC's data, which are done on sample also to see what is changing, how the use of the area are changing. For the price, so the value of the timber, the standing timber, so in France we have two types of forest, the public forest and the private forest. And for the public forest there are some sale of standing timber. So we are using this sale to have some statistic about the price of the standing timber. And we have some other statistic from the Agricultural Ministry, on using so some survey for survey by sawmills and loggings to know at which price they have bought wood, raw wood, and so on, and then we try to calculate how much it was as a standing timber. So the difficulty after that is to have an average price, because price is very different between firewood and timber wood and so on. So the person in charge of doing the calculation is using a matrix saying we have this type of price for different type of wood and type of forest, and then we have this type of forest, how much we have, and then she is calculating the average price again back. I don't know if it's enough.
So we go to the last round, starting with Sweden, France, and then last but not least, the Netherlands. Please make one question, identify the speaker that we like that question to be addressed to, if it's possible. I thank you in advance. Sweden, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks to all the presenters. I had a very similar question to Aarre in Finland, as I think Kaja asked, so perhaps we can give him the floor after this. And I would also like to say that we have very similar challenges as you have described in your presentation, so happy to keep in contact regarding this in the future. And then I had a question to Arturo regarding the forest monitoring framework, which has been announced by the European Commission as an upcoming monitoring framework, and if you already now see any links to the European forest accounts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation. My question is for all speakers, maybe for Eurostat, but when you look at the figures for the forest challenges, I mentioned the 0.2% of GDP for production of wood. And if I'm correct, you mentioned the figure for all ecosystem services of 170 billion euros for the whole European Union, so which is around 1-2% of GDP. How can we say that forest is the main issue for ecological matters and biodiversity matters? At the end, what we are able to evaluate is only 2% of GDP. How 2% of GDP should be the main issue for the 30 coming years? So it's not. It's a question for everybody of us.
Thanks for all this interesting presentation. My question has to do more with a general issue that came up with in several of these presentations, so I'm also not sure who's best to reflect on this. When we look at, well, forests are of course in SEEA Central Framework and also in ecosystem accounting. They come from different directions. They provide also different kind of information, but still there's an overlap. In particularly when we look at the area of forests. This is an issue because, of course, you get different figures. For example, in the Netherlands, we now have the situation that, well, we have area from the forest, from our forest accounts, extent accounts, and we also still have land cover land use statistics, and it's also different. So we have now 3 different figures for the area of forest. So my question is, how can we best deal with that? And well, of course, maybe that's also a question for Arturo. Is this issue going to also be dealt with in the new handbook that's being written? Would it be possible to come up with a kind of a bridge table? How can we best also communicate, of course, to the users this situation? Thanks.
So much, Shirt. I will invite Arturo to address the questions of the 2 last speakers, and I'll ask also Javier to address the point of Shirt, and then the point of Sweden. I will address them between the colleague from who is sitting from Finland, and if he has another presenter to address it to. Arturo, to you.
Thank you, Chair. I will try to answer quickly and to the point about the question from Sweden on the European monitoring framework. This is still work in progress. I cannot advance anything specific. I can say that the SEEA accounts are going to provide the indicators to this monitoring framework, but it's not going to be the main data source. There are going to be estimates from JRC, estimates from the European Environmental Agency, the nature restoration law, etc. But there will be a few indicators probably, but they are the indicators based on what we already have in our proposal. There are no more surprises. So data based on the work we are already doing. Franz asked about the size. I didn't provide any estimate of the size, so probably you are quoting some other speaker. But I don't question that we are talking about 1 or 2% of the GDP. The GDP is a very big number, so we could say 2% is a big number. In any case, what is underlying here is that we use market values. That is we are using all these methodologies inspired in the system of national accounts, which uses market values to evaluate the transactions between economic actors. And this is what we do in SEEA. If you do that, you get figures for ecosystem services around 1–2% of GDP. It is consistent with the size of agriculture in conventional way in our economies. But having said that, if we didn't have agriculture, we would starve to die, all of us. So it's something quite important, this 1% of the GDP. The value is not everything, and that's why we are promoting not only monetary estimates of ecosystem services, but also physical estimates that tell a different story about the planetary boundaries and many of the things that can be derived from them. Finally, the question from the Netherlands about different estimates of areas, is the handbook going to address it? Yes, our intention is to address it. We have to see exactly how we can do it. Probably we can provide more, move in the direction of providing explanations on which is the best data source to be used in which circumstance, rather than trying to reconcile different estimates. But this we have to see as we move forward into drafting this handbook. Thank you.
Yeah, well, regarding the question from Netherlands, I agree that there is an overlapping, and this can be confusing for users and countries. These differences are mostly due to different definitions of forest. So, as you may know, FAO definition is based on a combination of land cover and land use definition, while still many definitions of forest ecosystems are basically an aggregation of land cover, so it's basically based on land cover. I think this is, in most of the cases, or at least in the case of IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology, which has, by the way, not still developed a methodology to map these areas and estimate these areas, is due to data limitations. It's not actually to the actual definition of these ecosystems, which, by the way, also IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology doesn't provide a definition of forest. It classifies ecosystem in different ways. Some of them are clearly forest, some other may be or not, depending on the definition you use. So I think, it's important to clarify the definition. It's important to avoid overlapping as much as possible, particularly about this rebranding of new things. I mean, the MAES ecosystem classification is basically an aggregation of land cover classes, which include basically 3 areas, which can include tree plantations, but can not include barn forest, natural forest that in some cases fire is an intrinsic concept of the ecosystem. It happens in Europe, but also in other countries such as Australia. If there is a stand replacement fire under a land cover classification, it will be classified as grasslands. While for countries using land use, it will be considered forest. And also, I think, according to the IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology, it will still be considered a Mediterranean forest, because that's the nature of these ecosystems. And in addition to that, being clear on the difference, avoid overlapping as much as possible. If this has to be develop, be also clear on the crosswalks to try to at least estimate what the difference is, and also, as Arturo has mentioned, provide some advices on the best use of the data and the limitations.
Thank you so much, Javier. I thank all the presenters, Arturo, Beatrice, Aaron is still one. Aaron, are you still there?
Yeah.
Yeah. So please, the question from a colleague from Estonia is a burning question. Sweden. Sweden. All your colleagues there. Neighbors.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. The first, there was a question about economic account reporting, and in Finland, Statistics Finland takes care of this part of reporting. So the figures are based on national accounts system. We are not producing them in Natural Resources Institute. But then there was some question of evaluating timber, I think, and when National Forest Inventory produces information about timber, they also produce it by logs and by pulpwood and by wood waste. So we have also national statistics, regional national statistics about roundwood market prices, so we are using them to evaluate timber. It is only a simple task of multiplying, I think. And also we have statistics of roundwood removals. I think that they are also part of reporting. Maybe this was the questions, if I remember.
Sharon, we close now the sessions. I want to thank all the participants, Arturo, yourself, Aarre, Béatrice, Javier, Esther either in Australia, and Fernando from Spain. Thank you all, and thank you also you for the participation from the ground. Thank you. To you, Sharon.
Thank you. And I think now we're running a little bit behind schedule, so I will ask Michael to give us some advice on the time management and organization at this point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's fair to have a 5 minutes convenient break, but please not longer than 5 minutes, because we are really running super late, and I think we should also have a chance to have good discussions in the next session. So really 5 minutes, and we start in 5 minutes, okay? Whatever I have to do, do it in 5 minutes. Thank you.